Hello, everyone. Carousel Technology would like to welcome you to our 2023-2024 annual SLED Cybersecurity Priorities Report webinar. Carosoft is a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local government agencies. Carosoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors, including Splunk, Cumulus, AWS, Forescout, VMware, and Okta. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Jack Donahue, VP of Strategy and Innovation, New Harbor Security. Kurt Wood, Executive Director of SLED, Cybersecurity Priorities Report, former CIO of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Tina Karkoff, Splunk Industry Advisor, former CIO of the City of Houston. Chris Holden, Chief Client Officer, Recorded Future. Michael Gregg, CISO, the State of North Dakota. Adam Ford, CTO for State and Local Government and Education Zscaler. And now I'm going to pass the floor over to Jack.
Thanks, Amelia Taylor. And I want to thank all of you for spending some time with us. And I especially want to thank our panelists. In front of us, we have a group of individuals who've contributed a ton to the way that state and local government really helps to maintain secure infrastructure for folks. And we also have some of those same members who are helping vendors to understand the unique challenges that exist within what we think of as the SLED and the public sector community. And I'd love to give you a little bit more background about what the CPR is and why it was developed. The CPR originally began as an effort to better understand and articulate the challenges associated with trying to be a security leader inside state and local government or inside of higher education. It came about because in a series of conversations back in late 2021 and early 2022, we found out that a lot of these leaders had not felt heard. They had not felt that the community was being well represented, that necessarily vendors and analysts weren't really understanding how different it was. And so the CPR was created to take in feedback from leaders like those who are on this panel today and a lot of others to bring together a series of reports on the trends and the priorities that these leaders were servicing in the community that they needed to hear, right, that were different, because so many times we were hearing this marketplace called SLED being treated as something very much like the federal government, which it's not, or very much like small or medium business, which it also isn't. And so it was important to communicate what was happening inside that market so that the leaders would have the information they needed to do things like create support for what they had, understand outreach, being able to share information and gather insights from other leaders like them inside the marketplace. Now, we talk about this as being the SLED CPR, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the fact that there's a real need for nuance when reporting on the needs and trends within what we think of as the SLED community, right? We know that while they may be combined in this way because it makes it easier for sometimes vendors or analysts to speak about them as a group, they're really very, very different from one another. State and local government has a very different cadence, a very different financing structure than you'll find in higher education. And in fact, and we'll talk about it today with the team, that there are differences even between what happens inside a large city in terms of what they think about as prioritization around cybersecurity and IT infrastructure, and also the way that the higher education teams may deal with the same thing. The structure's just so different. So giving you that as sort of the background on why the SLED CPR exists, I think what we'll do is we'll end the screen share, and now we'll bring in some of the speakers and we'll actually start this conversation. And in starting it, we're going to start off with the topic that came up most frequently as we were doing our research into what was changing inside the world of this SLED community, and particularly in state and local government, as a result of a need to really federate and gather more value from some of these services that were very, very difficult to provide on a granular level. And the term of art that's used all the time is called whole of state. The idea that a statewide authority could take advantage of their expertise, their funding sources, the breadth of experience the teams may have, and the infrastructure that they support, to then offer some of those services to municipalities and tribal authorities and others within the states that they serve. And I'd like to start off, if I could, with a question for Kurt Wood. Now, Kurt comes to us having been the former CIO and Cabinet Secretary for Technology Services and Security in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he actually took on responsibility for being the executive director of this report, of this edition of the CPR. So, Kurt, as you were talking to folks, and as a former statewide CIO, what did you find most interesting about the increase in emphasis and focus on whole of state?
Well, thank you, Jack. And first of all, hello, panel members, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And certainly had the honor and privilege to work with the team on the report itself as the executive director. So I really appreciate that. Jack, I think, the way I look at this is that, when we talk about whole of state and this opportunity over this past, several months, a year or so to kind of engage with folks. And I think of it, as an opportunity. And what I think I've most been impressed with is the willingness to have this conversation, the urgency to have this conversation. I think certainly there is a difference. To your point, there is a difference between state and local government. There's differences between local governments themselves. There's differences between state agencies themselves. And I think, to me, when we talk about whole of state, whole of state means something different to everybody. But the grandiose or the grand scheme of things, it really is about kind of being together, having a unified approach, understanding that these are serious challenges that we're faced with today. They're not going away. They're increasing. The cyber threats are increasing, and really having that ability to kind of share the resources in a common framework and a common mission, I think is critical. So I think when interviewing folks and having conversations with folks across the country, again, understand that every state's a little bit different, every local government or community is a little bit different, but we all face similar challenges, and we all have a similar mission, at a high level, and really it's about making sure that our general public, our citizens, our communities maintain access to state or local services, because that's really where it's about. It's about really continuity of government, continuity of operations, making sure that folks actually get access and that we can actually provide access to service. And when you talk about that, with all these swim lanes within state government, local government, we're all dependent on each other, and one connects to another. So I think you know bring that conversation to the forefront, especially around our leadership. And again, I would say this too, it's really important. I think people are starting to finally grasp onto the concept as well, that it's just not about the IT guy or gal. It's just not about the cybersecurity person. It's just not about one group. It's all of us together. It's really a community. And it's our business community, it's our vendor community, it's our educational institutions, it's our elected officials, our legislatures, our operators, public safety, law enforcement, public health. Doesn't really matter. We are in this struggle together. So I think when we can elevate that and have that honest conversation and understand what we have to do together, forming that plan about whole of state and really kind of building out these programs and services and offerings and prioritizing, what needs to be done, what can be done, where your limitations are, and have an honest, for lack of a better term, an honest matrix of kind of where we're good, where we're not good, and not get caught up in the turf, not get caught up in, well, I can do that, but I really can't do that, and kind of funneling through those exercises around a whole of state approach. Again, it's funding, it's law, it's regulations, executive order, it's training, it's education, it's even from an educational perspective, making sure that our children in early on are started to learn about cyber hygiene. So I mean, it's really a different approach, not a different approach, but it's a newer approach that I think that I was very excited to hear about. And I think it's not where we need to be yet, but I think the conversation is there. It's at legislators' tables. It's at the executives' tables. It's at town managers' tables. So we're starting to make some progress in this space. That's how I think I've been looking at it. And honestly, this past year or so in researching, very refreshing to hear, the enthusiasm, the excitement to work together to kind of make us stronger together.
I think that's great. And I think that we saw some of that understanding and interest and some of that enthusiasm represented when the White House came out with a
Mhm.
couple of years ago, the state and local cybersecurity grant program. I think it brings us a perfect opportunity for Tina Kharkov, who is already, as a senior advisor for Splunk and formerly of Gartner, but who is also the CIO of the fourth largest city in the US, in Houston. Tina, as someone who would be both a participant and a consumer of whole of state sort of services, how did you see the benefits and the trade-offs for some of the folks who may be, listening to what's going on in this webinar today? How did you see the trade-offs and the cooperation between whole of state programs and being, an executive in a large city, consuming them?
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate the question because I think there are some trade-offs, right? But the advantages, in my opinion, definitely outweigh those trade-offs. So as Kurt said, we're looking at these smaller municipalities, and they're pretty much the larger target now, which is kind of a shift from where we were at. So I think the biggest benefit is that it allows any government agency, regardless of the size, to collaborate and pool expertise when it comes to cybersecurity. So as a CIO, I could capitalize on the knowledge of other people and maximize funding and resources. And resources is a really huge problem for municipalities. In addition to the funding, the cyber grant has taken care of a lot of that funding, but the resources are still problematic. The program, though, when you're looking whole of state, it allows agencies to share best practices, particularly with smaller ones, so that we can all be on the same page with regard to threat intelligence. When you're in a state scenario and you're a smaller municipality, what tends to happen is bad actors will go from place to place trying to breach the walls that have been set up. From a technology standpoint, if we all have the same wall set up, it becomes much harder for those bad actors and they go somewhere else. Maybe they try different tactics and then they go somewhere else. But the benefit is the economy of scale, right? So if we can all be set up in a similar situation, it makes it much harder for those bad actors to come in and take advantage of the smaller municipalities because they have the same cybersecurity strategies in place that the larger agencies do. When it comes to the trade-offs, though, I think it's difficult to coordinate all the diverse components under a single framework. That is a really big challenge because, again, there's that resource component where some of the smaller agencies just don't have the people to help. But that's where you have partners like New Harbor, like Splunk that come in, like Zscaler, and we can offer professional services that help take care of those resources that are lacking. Another trade-off is that smaller municipalities feel like they lose some of their control. And there is a bit of truth to that. We're working with Louisiana on their whole of state efforts. And I can tell you some of the smaller agencies feel that they don't have as much control in the decision making, but they're invited to the table. We want them to take part because it has to be something that everyone accepts and that everyone feels like they're a part of. When it comes to, like Kurt said it, in terms of, making sure that it's politicians are involved, the citizens are involved, members of each agency are involved. I think that's a critical component of this. And that's where you see the advantages far outweighing what those trade-offs might be.
That's great. And it's funny because one of the recurring themes as you were talking, Tina, was the benefits that one sees in whole of state because of the difficulty in finding talent and in terms of finding resources. And I'd like to pivot a little bit to talk about that because it's a real challenge, right? We know that there are anywhere from several 100,000 to several million, jobs left unfilled. You read about it all the time. And I'd like to talk to Michael Gregg here just for a second. So Mike, as the CISO in North Dakota, you've had some pretty remarkable success. And I think it'd be interesting to talk about because from a cyber education perspective, right, you led and advised on things from sort of like local and how do we train people to be, more exposed to it, to statewide awareness campaigns, right? And one of the most interesting things as we were doing the research for the CPR that we learned from you was that you had success in an internship and apprenticeship program that really resulted in a pretty remarkable level of conversion to full-time resources to fill some of those gaps that Tina talks about in terms of resources. Can you talk maybe a little bit about your own philosophy and some of the markers you had of success, the programs that you put together in the state of North Dakota?
Sure. Thanks, Jack. I think one of the big things for us is that you have to recognize that government has unique challenges when we're trying to get talent. It's a very unique challenge. And part of it is we don't always pay what you get in private industry. So what's the differentiator? How do we differentiate ourselves? I think one of those is that we look for people early in their career that are new. And for that, I generally look for people that are honest, humble, and hungry. Those are the three things I like to look for. And we start that really at the interview process. So we start at that point and kind of ask people, where do you want to go? Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? What would you like to do? We can also differentiate ourselves because if you went to work for a private industry and you did VPN, maybe you just do VPN, or if you do, whatever it may happen to be, you've got one task you do. We can move people around, so we can give them a much broader area of expertise to learn, so we keep them engaged and keep them growing. We have had about over an 80% transition rate of being able to bring people in as an apprentice and to be able to move them in or as an intern and be able to move them over to a full-time employee. And I think the other piece of that is once we get them moved over, I've invested heavily in education. So I've got a series of technical tracks for these individuals to do, which they all love. They enjoy doing that. They're like, oh, more technical stuff, forensics, malware analysis, yes. But in between, I have what I call a series of gates, meaning better presentation skills, better PowerPoint skills. If they get in the elevator and they're with the governor, lieutenant governor, I need them to be able to articulate in 3 to 5 sentences what's going on or what's up for that time. So I try to build both those soft skills and those technical skills and build this path of growth for them. So that's helped a lot for us. We've also had big success in bringing in former military, because former military many times are mission driven. So we can bring them in and say, here's our mission, here's our goals, here's what we're trying to do, and then build on that. So I think it's really an interesting thing that, you have to compete with private industry, but what you have to do is you have to figure out what are your differentiators and build on those differentiators where that's the piece you can market and push toward.
I think that's really, the capacity to instill in them that value for cybersecurity people to be communicators, to be conversationalists. If I could, just for really a quick minute, Kurt, I just want to bounce it back to you just for a second, just because I know your team from the Commonwealth, from our past relationships, and they have a lot of the skills that Michael just talked about instilling inside the folks that he's bringing up. You could tell me a little bit, maybe what you learned from this experience of talking to folks in the research for the CPR or from your own work in the Commonwealth, about sort of your experience or some recommendations you might give for how to develop those same kinds of people, perhaps later in their careers, or how do you find them and help them to be as successful as they are?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And Mike is spot on. And honestly, we did the research and listening to Mike talk about this with the passion in that, because I think it really starts there, really understanding the workforce, understanding the passion, understanding the mission. I think in my experience, I've been most successful in cyber or other programs is really identifying people early, and really aligning that sense of purpose, sense of mission. I think, in public service, I think it is an exciting job. You're not going to get rich, but I think there is a relationship to, cool stuff. And what I mean by that is there really is a sense of mission. Within government, you can work in many different aspects. You can work in public safety, homeland security, you can work in transportation. And these are really good skill sets and awareness and kind of technologies and the discipline of the business that you learn. And you get to embed or integrate, with the business objectives. And really, and I think there are people out there that do appreciate, understand what government is as it relates to, people and the services they bring and how critical they are. I think, if you look back at the pandemic, what was more important than government services at your local or state level or federal level in order to keep things good, right? I mean, public order, public health, public safety, things of that nature. So I think, working with folks, identifying people early, certainly I think, from a salary structure, it's always a challenge. I think, many states have made an effort. I know here in Massachusetts, they've made an effort to reclassify, skill sets and kind of lower certain expectations around kind of education requirements sometimes and kind of balance out, technical skills or soft skills. I think, that should not go undervalued. I think the soft skills that Mike mentioned are critical because he's right. You do need to be able to get these messages across. You need a deck or you need a 3 to 5 page, piece of paper that people can understand that's not technical jargon and kind of, what the outcomes, what the impacts are. So, when I look at that, I look at bringing those types of folks in. I think finally, I would say on the recruitment side, what I've learned is that just don't throw it over the wall to your HR team. you need to be personally invested in these people, meaning you need to have a seat at the table, inform the roles and responsibilities. Because I know at the state level, if you get stuck in those old-fashioned job descriptions, you will get, most people won't even meet them, and you won't attract the right people. People want, nice titles, they want cool operating environments, things of that nature. And it sounds crazy, but that's really, I think, a critical component of that. Take responsibility yourself, kind of invest in the people, spend time with them, give them feedback, listen to them, let them participate, let them represent your agency. The days of security of saying no all the time are gone. We have to actually kind of manage and support the operation and the outcomes, and having people that are, aware of that, are sensitive of that, and having your leadership team, kind of, lead through that and give people this opportunity to be engaged and do something really, worthwhile and beneficial to all, I think is critical.
It's interesting as we go through the course of the CPR and in understanding the way a lot of these leaders were thinking about their efforts. So much of it was focused on how to enable better security, how to
Mhm.
retain these skilled folks, the experiences they had, the successes they had in building the teams and the programs
Mhm.
to make it go. But one of the other topics that came up pretty frequently was a change in how they handle it when it goes sideways, right? When it goes wrong. And I'm talking here about cyber insurance, right? And I think that, probably everybody in the audience and the folks here on the panel as well are probably nodding their heads, because cyber insurance has become increasingly problematic, right? From an insurer's perspective, we've had discussions about, various large insurers who are thinking about getting out of the business entirely because they view it as almost an unlimited liability. At the same time, we've watched, more publicly acknowledged ransomware campaigns causing more and more of these events more broadly, right? So it's hard to understand, a specific demographic that are more likely to be exposed. And then we've talked to statewide officers and university officers who are describing the difficulties as premiums go up and coverage goes down. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Adam. Adam is the former CIO in the state of Illinois, right? The CISO for the state of Illinois, and being able to manage these, basically the subordination of risk, an idea of how to measure and minimize exposure, those kinds of things. Um, how do you see the appetite, right, for external cyber insurance versus self-insurance? And how do you see it evolving over the next couple of years in the current environment as it continues to change as quickly as it does?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, cyber insurance, I mean, it is an important part of managing risk for entities, and the decision whether to self-insure or to go and get insurance on the market broadly is something that each leader needs to make a determination. I think that there is, been a kind of strange leading along of basic hygienic principles from the insurance agencies over the past 5 years, where there has been lack of regulation. Insurance companies have required, potential customers to implement what we would oftentimes talk about, some of those basic table stakes cybersecurity fundamentals within their organization, vulnerability management, adding, identity management programs to themselves. And I think that has net raised the water, like high tide raises all boats for those participants in the cyber insurance market. But ultimately, cyber insurance as a either or, like cyber insurance or taking care of your basic hygiene, it's not an either or. We don't think of that in terms of our home lives. I have home insurance, but it doesn't mean that I regularly have open flames in my house. I mean, I do a lot of things to prevent fires from happening in my house, and government has done things through building codes and through, insistence on using safe materials. That's really driven down, the amount of fires that happen, within the United States and the rest of the world. So it's a component to that. But fundamentally, I think, in terms of thinking of it as either or, we have to do those basic things. We have to focus on the fundamentals, do our vulnerability management, implement best practices like zero trust architecture, bring that into our technology programs. What we have been doing in the past isn't working anymore, and that's why we see the high rate of claims. And fundamentally, government, we have an obligation to not just be prepared to rebuild from a disaster, but to try to prevent it from happening in the first place. Because when governments are out of business and unable to operate because we've had, major, specifically ransomware attacks, we're unable to meet our residents' needs. And so I think that, insurance is going to continue to be a hand wringer for many people. I think the move to self-insured probably makes sense for organizations that are going to be able to defend themselves in the first place. I think for smaller organizations, just dipping their toes in the water and just cyber insuring isn't enough. And I think that's where this whole conversation really goes to is, in terms of going back to that metaphor of a fire, like there's not one individual. Adam Ford doesn't know exactly how to prevent dangerous fires in my home. It's a whole neighborhood. It's a whole community. We've all come together. We work together. We have a fire department. We have, building code inspectors, and we have all of those different things, in addition to having insurance in the case of a catastrophic loss. So I think it'll continue to get more expensive because the attackers are going to continue to get more aggressive.
So it's funny because I think about it as this, sense of trying to achieve an equilibrium, right, between the investment we all make as leaders in our own cybersecurity and the decisions we make about subordinating that risk. Tina, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you a quick question as someone who actually had to manage that budget, the broad CIO budget for that city of Houston, right? And in your current experience as an advisor across a lot of different clients, right, with Splunk, how do you see people thinking about establishing sort of the criteria for what does that equilibrium mean? Like, when do they know they've done enough? Or how did you think about it as different organizations within the city of Houston was trying to make their decisions about what they should protect and what they should insure?
So I think when you look at, the value that comes out of the insurance, the first thing you have to communicate, especially with the folks that hold the purse strings, is that cybersecurity is an ongoing activity. It doesn't end. So if there's grant money today, that's great. But when that grant money ends, you have to figure it out. And so when you're looking at cyber insurance, the very first layer is, do I meet the requirements of the insurance company in order to qualify for insurance? And then you have to look at the risk that still sits within the organization. So if the risk is greater than what we're willing to have an appetite for, then we need to have cyber insurance. And keep in mind that cyber insurance doesn't prevent the attack, doesn't protect you because of an attack. It only protects you from the financial loss of an attack. And so I think when you're communicating the value, especially to your stakeholders who are going to be funding these initiatives, it's important that they understand what the cyber insurance is versus what it's not, because there's a lot of misnomers in terms of, do insurance companies pay ransoms? Well, maybe when we first started paying for ransoms, that was true. Now, because ransoms have become such a prevalent form of attack, insurance companies are actually not paying them because there's a disincentivizing factor to bad guys, right? If I know that I'm going to attack your system, but you're going to pay me because you're going to get the money back from insurance, I'm just going to keep going down the road and doing it again and again. So, I think there's a lot of, it all starts with how we share knowledge with our organizations. And I think when we approach cybersecurity as an ongoing initiative and not something that has a finite end, that's the beginning of it.
I think that one of the things that you just mentioned there really speaks to one of the challenges for state and local government authorities and for higher ed as well, which is that monetization strategy that you described, right? The way that the ransomware attack teams or groups or ransomware service providers look at it, that it becomes relatively straightforward for them to figure out how to do that attack, and whether it's insured or self-insured. They think about different ways in which they can be more likely to be able to monetize. And I think it really talks about this idea that we also reported on in the CPR, which was this expanding threat landscape, right? That there is an increasingly robust community of folks who are creating businesses around, being able to exploit the weaknesses that they find. And they're sharing that information among themselves, right? And there are entire communities that help to evolve more quickly different techniques that they found to be successful. And Chris Holden, what I'd like to do, I'd like to talk to you about your experience, because Recorded Future has for years been providing a variety of different types of threat intelligence to organizations, right? Whether we're talking about reputational analysis or current attacks or what's sort of happening, on the back channels themselves in the dark web. I'm just curious, like, what are you seeing in the environment of intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing within the SLED community that's being most effective, right? How are they doing the best jobs of both identifying and consuming what they need, sifting through it, and getting benefit from it, to really be able to address these threats as they're changing?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, as an organization that's been doing this as a commercial intelligence provider for a long time, things have evolved quite a bit over the last decade or so, and they continue to evolve quite quickly. And I'm gonna tie my response into a couple of things that others have said. Tina mentioned earlier this concept of economy of scale by having consistent technologies across areas. The idea of whole state, I think, is really interesting in the context of intelligence sharing and where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to focus on two kind of concepts. One mentioned in the report that we put together, which is around the opportunity to provide significant efficiency to security teams by way of using intelligence, and particularly, as mentioned, some of the challenges around talent and staffing and stuff like that. I think we'll get better and better, and I think in the SLED space we'll get better and better at attracting talent. I don't think that this is a problem that gets eliminated, like writ large. And I think that one of the compelling opportunities with technology overall and intelligence specifically representing that is the potential benefit and advantage that we can provide organizations in efficiency gains. If you can think about your technology architecture as one that is able to put to practice, whether it's technical indicators you generate yourselves, or you get shared from other organizations, or via an ISAC or through a government authority. If there are ways to put to work detection signatures for actor behavior in technologies that can be used beyond maybe a specific agency or a specific organization, but can be more applied to technologies that are used statewide potentially, the significant advantage that you have in putting the technology to work as an accelerator for defensive strategies is really important as a consideration as a complement to the people side. Because one thing that we are absolutely seeing as a trend is attackers in all different flavors are certainly putting technology to their advantage. Whether that be like the information sharing in forums and just like the discourse and communication between actors, or seeing actors start to put LLM technologies to work in AI. Unfortunately, it's not supposed to be dark and bleak. Unfortunately, the attacker side is 100% every day using the maximum technology that they have at their fingertips to go to work. And I think that wherever there's an opportunity for us as defenders, especially in the public, in the public space where we're protecting civilians and the services we provide, figuring out where we can deploy budget and resources and technologies to work to our advantage. And one of the compelling opportunities, I think, is architecting technology stacks that can take advantage of intelligence, either by automating what we find. Maybe you can automate detection strategies. Maybe you can automate prevention opportunities. As well as if you think down to a different area in something like vulnerability prioritization. How can we put to work intelligence related to exploitation of vulnerabilities so that you can work with your IT teams and counterparts and say, hey, don't go chasing this thing over here because it's a low risk or it's less likely to be exploited by actors. And we need to take care of business on these three vulnerabilities that we know we run these technologies on. And we see hospitals, we see municipal governments, we see sort of our peer organizations suffering from incidents that were because of this exploited vulnerability. So let's focus our effort and the limited energy and time and resource we have on those things. It was really interesting. We're about to release a report this afternoon publicly that looks at trends in attacker behavior from different ransomware groups. And this is really interesting, sort of capture of how different ransomware groups actually focus their efforts around exploitation of specific technology categories. So one group A, may focus on exploiting file transfer software. They might like sort of work their way down the train and see who uses different file transfer softwares. Another group may focus on exploitation of database technologies. Another one on server software. And so like taking advantage of some of those like the thematic trends that we see in actor behavior and allowing organizations like those of you who are represented on the phone to say like, okay, do we use any of those kinds of technologies? Do we use those across the state somewhere? If so, like let's focus our priority and effort on working with our IT departments and make sure we shore up those kinds of technologies. Like that kind of direction of effort is one of the, I think, the advantages of intelligence. And I think figuring out how over time, I agree with the person who said that it's a never-ending effort, figuring out how to architect systems that take advantage of the capabilities of intelligence. Because I think while there are advantages to the peer-to-peer sharing of intelligence, I think the real scale and the real like speed that organizations need in this environment is being able to have the technology put the intelligence to work on our behalf in complement to the people part of these activities. So I'll pause there for a second. And
Yeah, I think that what you've brought up, there's a couple of terms that you've used that I'd like to just bounce over to Mike Grigg if I could, Chris,
Sure.
which was you're talking about the information sharing that happens among these groups. You mentioned the ISACs, the concepts we're all
Sure.
familiar with, but you also mentioned the hard work that your team does in understanding what are sort of the applicable threats, right, to these different industries, these different organizations, which may be peers. I think those words used, the peers of one another.
Yeah.
Mike, in addition to the work that you did in creating a pretty successful program for getting people to stay working inside the state, you also managed to get the legislators in North Dakota to allow you to invest your time and the state's money in information sharing about threat and best practices in multiple states, which is kind of unusual, right? For a statewide officer to be able to apply his expertise outside the state is pretty unique. We've heard Chris talk quite a bit from an expert's perspective of how threat intelligence gathering is changing and growing and morphing. What kind of needs did you see? What kinds of sort of gaps were you trying to fill from your peers as well that are sharing this information that they saw was changing their consumption and maybe some of the automation that Chris talks about inside that threat intelligence paradigm?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, when I took the role, one of the things when I looked at threat intelligence and sharing, I saw it kind of as the triad of security. And what I mean by that is we have our federal partners. We have DHS, CISA, MSISAC, and we have a good partnership with them. A lot of data there we consume and move back and forth, and that's great. Second piece was whole estate. We didn't originally have a good program to exchange all the information inside our state. So I worked on building that out, threat intel report, getting everything done in state to share with our cities, our schools, our counties, to get that information going both ways. But then the other piece I found out was that states don't talk directly to each other that much, or they didn't. And I wanted to make that change. And when I got ready to make that change, we couldn't actually do it because we didn't have state law in place that said we could talk to other states that were not directly bordered with us. So worked with the governor, lieutenant governor, the House, the Senate, got unity of effort, got that law put in place where we could set up something called the Joint State SOC. And once we got this in place, I just simply went out, started talking to other states' CISOs and said, hey, Jack, if you're going to get attacked, I'm probably going to get attacked next. And if I'm going to get attacked, Adam's probably going to get attacked after that. So why don't we come together and share that information directly in real time that we can? And that was a big benefit. The other one is you think about we have these kind of events for CISOs, for directors, for leadership. We've got NASIO, we've got all this other stuff. But what about the boots on the ground? The threat analysts, the other individuals, they're very siloed. So we now bring those individuals together. We've done this for 3 years. And we have a tabletop and live fire exercise every 6 months. And the neat part about it is one analyst may look at this and say, hey, I've never done this way. I've always done it another way. And the other analyst from another state may say, I've never looked at it this way. I look at it a different way. And they start seeing new ways to do things outside their paradigm or scope. and building that skill set, and it allows them to talk directly. So when we have large scale incidents, be it denial of service, whatever it may happen to be, these analysts are comfortable reaching out to others and sharing that information in real time and speeding up that defensive capability. So to me, that's been huge, being able to get these individuals that forum where they can talk and exchange that information. And as Adam said earlier, that rising tide raises all boats. It raises this up and it raises the skill level and competency of all of them.
So that's a great model. And Chris, if I can just come back to you just for a moment, right? You're providing this information into clients like this, and you're seeing them do that sharing. Do you think that that level of communication, the expertise that's being shared in the way that Mike just described it, is changing the nature of the way people expect to consume data from you guys and from other threat intelligence providers? And are the requests sort of more nuanced? So that are you finding that they're more demanding perhaps than they were 5 or 10 years ago?
Oh, they're just different. I don't know if they're more demanding. They're just different, right? No, I mean, I think of course, as the discipline has matured over it, like outside of the, the national level intelligence community type groups, and like that discipline and the skills and the actual deployment of intelligence in private enterprises, in municipal governments and security teams like that has extended, then I think the maturity has expanded and the asks have been different. I think one of the things that has stood out to me recently is that I think there have been stereotypes over I guess since I've been doing this, which is, intelligence is a feed. And intelligence is like a set of indicators, and you dump that in and it has mixed results, and some feeds are great and provide service, put in the right control and like provided with the right efficacy. And some are just kind of noise. And then the other side of the other stereotype that's quite common, I think, is that threat intelligence is like this long form prose reporting that you have to have the expert of experts to go and actually write, and requires a lot of time. And it actually requires some stakeholder on the other side to actually be reasonably smart about how to take advantage of something written like that. Like it's quite difficult to use that. And I think that the nuance that's come about recently is receiving inquiries and expectations of more targeted requirements for organizations. Maybe they have specific security technologies that consume intelligence in specific, shapes, sizes, flavors, and they're asking for, more specificity to what we deliver to them. Maybe it is indicators, but with more context related to them, so they can action them in the right way. Thinking a lot more about the requirements of the organization with which they're representing. So if I'm working in a municipal government and I deliver services to citizens that include like mobile services, like maybe I need intelligence that specifically speaks to the risks that my citizens might face from receiving text messages from my government authority. What is that? Could they be defrauded in that way? And then the intelligence requirement for that organization is actually adjusting to the needs of whatever agency and whatever citizen group they're representing and services they provide. So I think that those are some of the ways that we've seen it evolve. It's gotten a little bit beyond like, oh, let me make sure that I know what the headline news is, and let me do a little bit better than just dumping a bunch of indicators of compromise into some detection technology. But instead, let me figure out what is it that is most relevant to the services that my agency provides to the people that I serve, and how can I orient the intelligence to put our security into a better posture to serve that citizen base. So
yeah.
Jack, can I jump in on that just
Of course, Adam.
briefly? Yeah. So during my time in Illinois, we ran a statewide election security program, and as part of that, with threat intelligence, we wanted to share that information to these people who run elections, not technologists, but election operators.
Yeah.
And so we started to do report outs. I tended to call it like not in a derogatory term, but gossip. Like hearing that like a neighbor had received information like this phishing attack really helped to bring forward, especially whole of state, like a sense of community. And it built trust when they heard that someone, you know, 2 counties over had received this specific attack. For a programmatic perspective, I mean, those alerts that were going out weren't necessarily being implemented into defensive tech or tactics and techniques, but it built confidence in the program. It built confidence in the participants that they were a part of something, which I think was a huge contributor, you know, to the success of the program there in Illinois, and also added to, you know, the ability for us at the state level or at the higher levels to start talking about more complicated technology solutions where they felt included and not spoken over, but that perhaps, you know, people who had implemented multi-factor authentication were resistant to that, or zero trust architected networks did not have the same level of, you know, and so they get these stories. I think so. Threat intelligence at different levels means different things, but I think, Chris, you're right on it. Like, if it's meaningful to people, then they feel like they belong, and they feel like this whole participation together is more effective. So.
I think that's great, because I think it sort of redounds to the benefit of the CPR's purpose in general. You know, one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar for an audience that may or may not have been really exposed to it was to share the specific findings we've talked about, right? Whether it's whole of state or how to retain talent or the insurance or what we've been talking about here now, which is the threat landscape. And I think what we've heard is sort of a thread that runs through it, a theme that runs through all of it, is this idea of partnership and of sharing, right? Whether we're talking about the best practices around retaining people and getting people to stay on board, you know, whether it's ways in which to communicate better, whether it's we're talking about threat intel. And I think that one of the learnings we have out of the work that Kurt and the team did on the CPR is that partnership is it's sort of a different thing that exists in this community than sometimes we see in the private sector, right? Where people are sort of fighting with one another and they're uncomfortable sharing information because they may see it as a business differentiator. So I think that sharing of information has been a really big deal. And I want to encourage the attendees to this webinar. If you have questions for this group, one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to them all for showing up is because they can also answer some of your questions that may be more specific to your own engagements, your own needs around cybersecurity. And I'm happy to see that there's a couple of questions already in the bucket. But if there are more folks who have questions around these topics or others that can be answered by the kind of leaders that we've managed to gather here today, I want to make sure you open them up. So as we sort of exit the part of the program where we're talking about, you know, what's in the CPR, with the encouragement that you take a look at it, I'd love to just touch on a couple of those questions with the panel's patience with me. And one of them refers to something that we talked about super briefly. The question came in, it says, someone's been told that the state and local cybersecurity grant program funding is ending next year. And the question is, does this panel have any recommendations for other grants or ways to continue to pay for the programs? I don't want to just foist this off on one of you. Any of you have any particular experience or recommendations? It looks like Tina is the first up. So Tina, how can you help?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. So, you know, you need to be preparing your 5-year budgets now, right? That's the obvious one, is that you want to seek alternative funding sources as soon as humanly possible. And that means, again, making sure that the organization sees cybersecurity as an ongoing effort. But there's other things that you can do. So you can look at the resources that you've got in place today, and how can you train your existing resources to be prepared for that time when the grant funding goes away? Because you may have to do the same amount of work with less funding. So start training your employees now for what it means to take over if you have a vendor doing it, or if you're sharing resources out with other organizations. And then prioritize the things that are working well, right? Not every component of whole of state is going to work as effectively for every single organization. So if you can start, if each organization can start saying, you know, off of the menu of security solutions that are available to me, here's the 5, and maybe not the 10 or 20 that work for my organization. So now I can focus on finding funding for those, for, you know, in a limited capacity, because I may not need all the other things that have been made available to me under the grant. So, you know, in addition to that, I would suggest look at if there's grant extensions, look at the possibility of other grants that might be available. And so, you know, there are things that we can be doing right now before those grants expire, because the time to look for the grant funding or the next source of funding is right now. It's not waiting until the end.
Nice. Yeah, go right ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, so I totally agree. And I think, it really goes back to kind of the basics that I introed on about really about ownership and, executive awareness. Really you have to, at least my perspective, you have to really build this into your program. It has to be part of the fabric of who you are. It needs to be part of your DNA. You need to do the legwork, as a state CISO or a state CIO or a leader, in your space. You need to get to the right people, your town leadership, your executive leadership, your governors, your legislatures, and understand this is part of, your operation. Because I think one of the challenge with grant money, no matter where it comes from, people tend to go down and get grant money, it goes away, and then it's forgotten. I think that's an easy out. I think we see that in the IT space. A lot of times, financial folks will think this is a one and done. The leadership says, "Oh, I bought it once. Why do I have to do it again?" I know here in Massachusetts, we built out a successful program, where over the last 5 or 6 years, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars put into a capital program that we've since annualized. But you need to have the information. You need to be able to be readily talk about it. To Mike's point earlier, you need to have that ability to talk and communicate to all the different audiences, that participate in this process. And you need to be succinct. You need to give them an understanding and appreciation of what it means to do this and what it means not to do that. And you need to continue that. I would not rely on federal grants forever. I would not rely on state grants. You need to really fundamentally build this into your DNA and your fabric of your organization. It's not easy, but you've got to kind of work towards that and always be, it's got to become your operating budget day in, day out. Because once you go up this way, you can't go backwards. Everything keeps continuing to grow.
Yeah, I think, Jack, if I could say, I mean, like one thing is like I saw it when I was still CISO of Illinois, there's sometimes a reluctance to implement a solution to a problem today because of, uncertain funding 3 years from now. And I would say that, just because I'm in a fire metaphor mood, like the house is on fire today. And so leverage, I encourage organizations to leverage all of the services that they can right away and to take full advantage of the funding. Not that funding is a problem for tomorrow, but I think that the federal dollars have been slow to come to the states and to locals, but now they're here. And reluctance to take advantage of them it just would make certain that there won't be additional funds. If programs are successful, if it's demonstrated that this investment in states and locals yields good fruit, then there's going to be a lot of pressure for continued funding and expanded funding. And many states are using these for services that aren't, these aren't one-time expenses. They're bringing in whole of state EDR or implementing products like Zscaler for IoT. These kinds of solutions are going to be an ongoing investment, and they should demonstrate with the information that they provide, the data of their efficacy. That makes it really hard. Like don't self-limit. I say for practitioners, don't self-limit. That's the legislature's job to continue to provide funding. Your job is to protect your organization today and to prove the value of your efforts.
Good. I think that
one there.
Go right ahead, Mike.
Look, the one I'd add is put the metrics in place to be able to measure that success. So do the NCSR, do a cyber maturity assessment, do the cybersecurity framework where it can show where you were at, the impact this money has made, if you lose that money or funding, what that would actually do. So when we first got the IAJ funding, the funding you're talking about, we actually went to the House and the Senate and got the 10% match. So we got House and Senate to agree to actually give the match because they saw the importance of it. So you have to have the metrics, as the other speakers have kind of said, to be able to build on that. Say, here's the impact we've been able to do. Here's what we need to do to sustain that. If we don't, this could be the impact from that on the other side.
I think that there are two questions that just popped into the screen that are related. And I think that they both relate to how do smaller organizations, small town government, local government, respond to justify investment. I think the gang of you just did a great job of describing sort of the latter. How do you convince the government to invest, the town government to invest in something which may be outside their scope, and maybe whole of state security is another way it becomes sort of more tractable for them, sort of more supportable for them. I would though like to throw the second half of that. Well, it's the question that came before it, but the second element of that same query, which is when there is an incident, right? We spend a lot of time talking about how to try to help things not happen, but when an incident does happen, How do leaders like yourselves expect a local government to respond when these things do happen to them? Like, who do they call? How do they get involved? What are the right first steps for them to take?
So Jack, I can take that initially. When you have a small government entity that experiences a cyber attack, it's critical for them to stop the attack and then reach out to their partners, right, their ecosystem, and say, hey, we've had this problem, right? Reach out to your vendors. What can you do to help me? Because most of the vendors that any government entity is engaging with, they're going to help because that's part of their DNA. I think the second piece of it, though, is that small government organizations can always rely on the bigger organizations. So if it's City of Houston and there's a smaller entity that has a cybersecurity attack, they could always come to us and say, hey, we need some resources, and we would provide those resources. They can also go to the state level or the county level and ask for resources to be shared, because during an attack, it's a more immediate response that's needed, and that's where you reach out to your other government partners to say, hey, what can you do to help us? And more often than not, those responses are going to be swift, and you're going to get a team of people that can come in and really look at the problem and how you should appropriately respond, because sometimes it's that response. If the response is not sufficient, that's when your residents lose faith in the government's ability to delve out services. And that's something that's absolutely critical. We don't want people to stop coming to our doors to say, hey, I've got a need and I know you can fill it. The worst thing in the world that can happen is when those folks don't feel that trust.
Kurt?
Again, spot on. Totally agree. I think that it goes back to the importance of actually having an incident response plan. Because I've, even in the state agencies over the years, if people don't know who to call, that's a problem, right? And we see that all the time. They're not documented, procedures aren't documented. So I think, we still have a long way to go about, incident reporting, incident response. So I think, certainly the whole state certainly, highlights that. But I think, you know, we as government entities need to make sure we have a game plan ahead of time. We should train and test, train and exercise on that. We have to rely on relationships, and at the end of the day, it's great to have all this technology. It still boils down to having the appropriate relationships and knowing who to call for help. It doesn't do any good to call somebody over here if they really can't help you, because that's who's in your Rolodex. So you really need to kind of think about that, and keep that framework available and updated, and continue. I think finally, I would just say too, it's critical for me to make sure that there's an awareness of these things happening, because I think when you incident report something, you report it. It gives us situational awareness across the landscape. Something happens in the city of Boston. If I don't know about it, I find out about the Channel 5 News. That's a problem, versus, well, me having something happen in our Health and Human Services environment and our other agencies don't know, because that's really about, we're all connected together. So having that situational awareness, because we may be seeing the same thing, we may not be seeing the same things. That goes to the point about what Mike was talking about, even interstate, collaboration and cooperation, really understanding, the trending or what's being impacted. So I think we still have a long way to go. I think we've made great progress there, but we still need to make sure that, that's part and parcel of our game plan.
Fantastic. So I want to thank the audience for the questions. There's a couple more out there that we'll take responsibility for getting answers to and blasting it out to you all as the audience. I want to thank this team of folks for providing the information and education that they have. I've learned a ton through this process as Kurt's gone through the research associated with building the CPR. I love reading the end of it, right? Some of the conclusions that are reached. And I've learned a ton, and I'm super benefiting from being exposed to the people that the audience can see here on the screen with us, and others who helped us to form it. I'd encourage you, if you haven't read the CPR, read it now. You can get a sense for what it looks like. You see on the screen in front of you, right? There's an easy way to go and get it. I'd encourage you to take a look. If you want to see how things have changed, you can look at the one from last year. And with Kurt's willingness, perhaps we'll have an even better one next year, right? So get yourself grounded, take some insight. If you need some support for your local government about why this is important, it may be in there. If you're trying to better inform or expand your whole estate, maybe it's in here. If you're trying to think about ways to improve your retention and finding new folks, it may be in here. So I'd really encourage you to pick it up and take it down. Again, I want to thank you all for participating with myself and the team today. And I really, really want to thank this panel of leaders. It's a unique privilege to be able to just sort of hang out with them, ask and understand and talk about these issues as somebody really cares about cybersecurity, particularly in the way that these communities are served. So I want to thank all of you. And with that, back over to our wonderful host, Taylor, to wrap things up.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to all of the speakers for today for the presentation. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for being with us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful for you and your organization. If you have any questions or would like to request more information, feel free to contact the Splunk team at Carahsoft. Our contact information is being displayed on your screen, so please don't hesitate to call or email us. Thank you all and have a great day.